You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, there's been a lot of talk in the news right now about Donald Trump's sentencing. Of course, that sentencing was pushed back until after the election. But here's the question that I want to know in particular, and that is the question of pardons. We've spoken in the past about the prospect of a self-pardon for Trump. If he did indeed try to grant himself a self-pardon, when would we know that he did that? Would it be at the time he's sentenced? Would it be before the sentencing hearing itself? When would we find out?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are no definitive answers because a self-pardon has never been attempted. Now, there's a lot to unpack, but let's back up. First of all, a self-pardon has been declared improper, unlawful, and unconstitutional by the DOJ Office of Legal Counsel back in 1974 when they feared Richard Nixon might try to pardon himself. They jumped out there with a legal opinion that, mind you, is not the law, it's not precedent, and it's not binding. It's just the opinion of the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice. They said, we do not believe a self-pardon is lawful, but they engaged in no real analysis, and there's no law supporting that opinion. So we don't know whether a presidential self-pardon would be upheld by the courts or struck down by the courts. And I don't think I'm going to trail off into what this Supreme Court might do if, for example, a Donald Trump tried to pardon himself. Here are some of the other important data points. Did Donald Trump give himself a pardon? We obviously don't know the answer to that question because there is absolutely no legal requirement that for a pardon to take lawful effect, it must be made public. What do I mean by that? If Donald Trump, for example, gave a pardon to, let's say, Jared Kushner, and it was never revealed publicly until Jared Kushner got indicted for a crime, it would still be a lawful pardon. Why? Because there's no requirement that it be publicized or made public. As long as it was signed by the president while he was still in office and delivered to Jared Kushner, they could keep it in their back pocket. They could reveal it whenever they decided the time is right. Now, let's talk about what are the data points that suggests Donald Trump may have pardoned himself and just not told anybody about it yet. Well, one, when was Donald Trump known to forego a good grift? Right. Never, right? So if he had the power to pardon himself, don't you think he probably exercised it even if he did it in secret? Here's another data point, Brian. Kellyanne Conway, she of Alternative Facts, wrote a book, which I did not read, but I read the New York Times book review. And one of the things that was reported was in there, Kellyanne Conway said near the end of Donald Trump's term before he left office, he ambled up to her and said, I'm going to use her words, hey, honey, you want a pardon? Everybody's going to need one. She said that he offered her an unsolicited blanket pardon for all crimes she might have committed while he was president. So she reported in her book that she didn't accept it, but she also is, the queen of alternative facts. So maybe she rejected it, maybe she accepted it. We don't know. Here's another data point. Remember Jared Kushner, as it was revealed during the January 6th House Select Committee hearings, said, you know what, I didn't have time to worry about anything but pardons because, in the final days of the Trump administration, my father-in-law's administration, I was so busy cranking out pardons for him to sign that I couldn't really pay attention to anything else. Interestingly, Jared Kushner's father went on to get one of those presidential pardons, which at least has the smell of cronyism and corruption, but that is a fact. Let me just add as a quick footnote, many of the people that Donald Trump pardoned went on to commit other crimes. I urge our viewers to look at the reporting, person after person after person, including one who is just locked up in, I believe, New York for strangling his wife. That's somebody who was pardoned by Donald Trump. So all of this sort of brings us to the question that you asked. If Donald Trump pardoned himself, when might we know it? And really the answer is when he chose to disclose it. So when might he choose to disclose it? There is no one right time to disclose a presidential self-pardon. First of all, he could have disclosed it if he issued himself one when he was indicted. At the moment he knew he would be indicted for crimes he was alleged to have committed while president, not after he left the presidency. So a presidential self-pardon would not help him in the Florida prosecution for unlawfully retaining classified documents, obstructing justice, and violating our nation's espionage laws. That was after he left the presidency. That wouldn't help him. It also wouldn't help him in the New York case or in the Georgia case, because those are state crimes, and a federal presidential pardon cannot be used to do away with state crimes or state convictions. But it would apply potentially to his federal prosecution in D.C. for trying to overturn the results of the 2020 election. So the moment he got indicted, he could have pulled a self-pardon out of his pocket and said, look at this, friends, I can't be prosecuted. You have to dismiss the case. That would be one moment. What would be the pro of doing it at that moment? It would be then they could start fighting about the legality of the pardon rather than him sort of proceeding on his way to a trial. Now, we all know it's gone up to the Supreme Court, back down. It's been a long and very bumpy road on the way to a trial. But he could have revealed the pardon. It could have been litigated up front, and then presumably once the court settled the question of whether a president can pardon himself or not, I think the answer should be no, but it's an open question of law, then they could have moved on to the case itself and moved it in the direction of a trial. But that might not be the optimal moment. Why do I say that? If Donald Trump opted to keep the pardon hidden until he went to trial, there's always the chance the jury would have found him not guilty, and then he never would have had to pull out the pardon, and it never would have been a legal issue that would have been fought in court over whether a presidential pardon is a lawful exercise of the pardon power or not. Or he could have waited to see what his sentence was. If his sentence was one to probation after conviction, he could certainly pull out the pardon then and say, listen, I'm not suffering any imprisonment, so this is not a big deal to me that I got probation, but I would like to now try to wipe the conviction off the books. So I'm offering up the pardon that I issued to myself before I left the presidency, and let's go ahead and have that legal fight over it now. So I think you can see, Brian, there is no one optimal time to, reveal a self-pardon in the event Trump gave himself a pardon. There are different pros and cons along the way, and I still find it very hard to believe that Donald Trump didn't at least sign a pardon to himself, hide it away in a safe or a drawer somewhere, only to decide whether he should pull it out in the future when the time is right. What is the significant legal downside to him having done that, issuing himself a pardon? It's what the Supreme Court said about pardons back in 1915.
That it carries with it an imputation of guilt.
Beautiful, beautiful. If in 1915 in the Burdick case, the Supreme Court said a pardon carries with it an imputation of guilt, and accepting a pardon is at least some confession of guilt. So that would literally be Donald Trump signing a document, pardoning himself, which could also serve as a confession of guilt. So, there is kind of a philosophical challenge you have there. Do I do it recognizing I'm admitting that I needed it because I had to get some cover for the crimes I committed, or do I forego giving myself a pardon?
Right. I mean, one might think, logic would suggest that rather than going through the process of all of the bad press that comes with a jury trial, a conviction, which of course was laid in his lap, that it might be easier for somebody like Donald Trump to just bring out the pardon right in the beginning, knowing full well that his audience isn't going to buy this notion that a pardon carries with it an imputation of guilt, but that the press might be better for him than going through all of the hellishness that is sitting through an entire trial and being convicted on every single count.
I agree, but let's think about this. What if the evidence is not as overwhelming as we suspect it is of Donald Trump's guilt, but a confession, a pardon that you had to give yourself, which the Supreme Court said carries with it at least some confession of the underlying crimes? Maybe that would put the jury over the top in concluding beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump was guilty. So there is no one best answer for whether he should have granted himself a pardon.
Okay, well, with that said, I mean, this is an issue that's still going to percolate as Donald Trump awaits movement in his D.C. trial and, of course, some movement as well in the Florida trial. With that said, there, of course, can't be a pardon brought forward in New York or Georgia because those are both state prosecutions. But I think it's interesting to have this conversation and be prepared in the event that Donald Trump does try to whip out a self-pardon in the event that he is that these cases both move forward. So with that said, we will, of course, stay on top of this. For those watching right now, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.